Hello everybody, Roddy here at the Good Spirits Company with my colleague Sara.
Hello.
Who is going to give us a quick rundown on the bottles that we opened for one of our recent events. We do tastings all the time. That's been a great way to let people explore the kind of wide range of spirits that we got. And last Friday, Sara, you were hosting a tequila and agave tasting. So tell us what you put on, what you selected.
So for our lineup for our agave tasting, we always try and split it 3 tequila and 3 other agave spirits. So because the category isn't just tequila and mezcal. That's why you should come to one of our tastings, is to hear all about it. But for this tasting, we've essentially started with the Lost Explorer Blanco. The Lost Explorer is a brand that started in 2020. They previously exclusively made mezcal only, but this is their first venture into making tequila. So this came out last year, so we were very keen to get this on a tasting and get to try it, so we could see just how good it is and how it compares to the quality of the mezcals that they make. So that was our Blanco. We then had the Tierra Noble, which is our Reposado. So your Reposado tequilas, they do have some aging, and for a Reposado it is between 2 months and a year. I'd love to say I could get the exact duration this was aged for, but
they don't tell you that, kind of.
Notes were not plentiful on this one. We then moved on to our Añejo tequila, which is aged for between 1 year and 3 years. And this is from the Tapatio brand, which Tapatio has a soft spot in my heart. It's the tequila that made me realise what tequila can be.
It's pretty much, we always really try and stock Tapatio, don't we?
Yeah, we generally always have at least one of the Tapatio range on the shelves, because they have their Blanco, their Reposado, the Añejo, which there's not actually much left in the bottle. In fact, there's nothing left in the bottle. And then they have a 55% one as well. But the Añejo I really like is aged for 18 months in bourbon casks. But from the colour of it, you wouldn't guess that it had been in for 18 months, because it's super, super light, because the casks they use they've been used quite a few times, so you're still getting the real agave heart
so
and spirit.
Subtle wood influence.
Yes, yeah. The tequila is shining in this one.
Right.
On the second half of this tasting, we then went on to our other agave spirits, and we started with a Raicilla, this one here, which can be made from other types of agave, and it's similar to tequila and mezcal, can only be made in certain regions and areas. What is fascinating about this one is it is single distillation. So one distillation, not your double distillation or triple distillation that you see in other spirits, one single distillation where it managed to get up to 40.9%. It's very interesting. Is
that a euphemism? Interesting.
No, it is. It's fascinating, and it actually scored really well.
Popular.
Yeah, on our final, because for the vote we did favourite tequila, favourite agave spirit, and it was actually, there was one vote between the 3 on the final line, so they all did very well. We then went on to the Ojo de Tigre, which is the mezcal, and it is a Reposado mezcal. So this has been aged for, I think this one was 5 months or so, but what's quite interesting is this is 2 different agaves. This is Espadín and Tobala. So 2 of the different agaves that you can use for mezcal have gone into this one. They have 2 different distillates, they blend them together and then they age it. And then the final one on the night was the Vago Elote, which this is a really interesting mezcal, because between the second and third distillation, they add some roasted corn and distill the corn in the spirit. So you
agave and corn?
Yes, agave and corn. So it's essentially, it's a pechuga, because there's been something added into the still.
Right, you're going to have to explain pechuga.
So pechuga is a type of mezcal that's generally a celebratory mezcal. They're made in very, very small batch, normally by families for big celebrations, weddings, birthdays, etc. The most famous type of pechuga is when they add a poultry breast, so turkey or chicken breast, into the still during distillation. So the vapours and everything are running through the meat, extracting the flavours and adding a certain meatiness to the product. So, but with this one, they're using corn instead. So as I started explaining Pechugas, and there was a few vegans who had very horrified looks on their faces, I had to point out, this is fine. This is vegan friendly.
Vegan friendly.
Yes. So that was our final spirit on the lineup.
And then, so Sara spends a lot of time coming up with new drinks for our bottle cocktail range and for the events that we do. But I think you've got some news about the drink that you came up with for last Friday, which, for want of a better name, at 10 to 7 we decided it was going to be called Shockaroonie. It's pink. So tell us about Shockaroonie.
We might need to change the name.
Might need to change
the name.
Working title.
That's the working title for it, in-house title. So the welcome cocktail we did on Saturday night was a twist on a Rosita, which is Blanco tequila, sweet vermouth, dry vermouth, and a bitter liqueur, normally Campari. So for this one, we used Los Arcos Distillado de Agave, tequila, not tequila. We then swapped out the sweet vermouth for Chambéryzette, which is a strawberry aperitif, which is just beautiful. We then used Cocchi Dry vermouth, and we swapped out the Campari for Cocchi Rosa. So it had a real sort of strawberry, herbaceous note to it.
Very strawberry.
Yeah,
it's
and
delicious.
It was very, very easy drinking. So what we have decided is that will actually be an ideal spring, summer. I say spring, summer because I don't know when we'll get these done. Bottled cocktail, and it will also be our first tequila bottled cocktail as well.
Excellent. So look out for that sometime soon, and we encourage you to go have a look at our events page and maybe come along to one of our other tastings. See you next time.